In the early 1970s, the town of Santa Cruz, California was plunged into panic. Innocent young women were being raped, murdered and dismembered. At that time, two serial killers, John Frazier and Herbert Mullins, were perpetrating crimes in the town of Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz received the nickname, "the murder capital of the world," in the press. But what they did not know was that a young man that was known to them as the Gentle Giant was the source of their misery. This is the story of Edmund Kemper, better known as the Coed Butcher, a serial killer who terrorized the neighborhoods of this town. Edmund Emil Kemper III was born on December 18, 1948 in Burbank, California. He was the son of Edmund Emil Kemper Jr. and Clarnell Elizabeth Kemper. Edmund Jr. was a World War II veteran who, after the war, tested nuclear weapons at the Pacific Proving Grounds before returning to California, where he worked as an electrician. Clarnell often complained about her husband's menial electrician job. Edmund Jr. later stated that suicide missions in wartime and the atomic bomb testings were nothing compared to living with Clarnell, and that she affected him more than 396 days and nights of fighting on the front did. Ed Kemper had two sisters. One of them was 6 years older and the other one 2 years younger. He was a very sensitive and intelligent boy. He was taller than his peers by far. Like many families at that time, Ed's parents raised chickens and grew their own vegetables in the backyard. Ed idolized his father, and he loved to spend time with the chickens and the other farm animals as if they were his pets. He gave them all names and played games with them in the backyard. His mother was always quick to reprimand and discipline him, so he was always a very well-behaved child. His two sisters received more love and attention from their mother. Ed was still in primary school when his father chopped two of the chickens' heads off in front of him. Later, of course, his mother would cook the birds for dinner. When he refused to eat his pets, his parents shouted at him over the dining table, forcing him to eat the chicken through his tears. That night, he got on his bike and rode as far away as he could, but he found that there was no escape. His father would slowly force him to get over his sensitivity of watching animals killed. As time went on, he grew numb to the blood and the headings, and he learned to accept it as just a part of life. At the age of 10, he buried a pet cat alive, then dug it up, decapitated it, and mounted its head on a spike. Kemper later stated that he derived pleasure from successfully lying to his family about killing the cat. At the age of 13, he killed another family cat when he perceived it to be favoring his younger sister, Allen Lee Kemper, over him. He kept pieces of it in his closet until his mother found them. He couldn't understand why the adults in his life were telling him that killing farm animals was acceptable, but killing a dog or a cat was simply not. His parents got a divorce when he was 9 years old. He was sent to live with his mother Clarnell in Helena, Montana. Kemper had a severely dysfunctional relationship with his mother, a neurotic, domineering alcoholic who frequently belittled, humiliated, and abused him. His mother was so bitter that she began to take all of her hatred out on Ed. It was a difficult time for Edmund. He believed he was a constant reminder of the failed marriage between her parents. She said that all men were worthless, and she began to treat Ed far worse than his sisters simply because he was a boy. She moved them to Montana, and she got remarried. The second marriage didn't work out either, and his mother went through a string of boyfriends that never lasted very long as a male role model. As a child being raised by an old single mother, they did not have a lot of toys, so they would use their imagination instead. There was even a time when, while playing with his sister's dolls, he cut the heads of the dolls off. Ed read a lot of books from the library and included in his reading horrific stories from history, from the Vikings to the Holocaust. He suggested that he and his younger sisters could play a game called the gas chamber. They tied each other up in a chair just to see who could get themselves out of the bondage, the quickest pretending that they were stuck in a room that was filling up with deadly gas. They also played electric chair, in which he asked his younger sister to tie him up and flip an imaginary switch. He would then tumble over and writhe on the floor, pretending that he was being executed by gas inhalation or electric shock. Ed's mother thought he was dangerous. She was convinced that he would hurt his sisters. She did not trust him. Instead of a bed, he had to sleep on a cot with a sleeping bag, with only a single light bulb hanging from a string. According to him, he interpreted that his mother had a deeper meaning behind her actions. Kemper had a severely dysfunctional relationship with his mother, a neurotic, domineering alcoholic who frequently belittled, humiliated, and abused him. Clarnell often made her son sleep in a locked basement because she feared that he would harm his sisters, regularly mocked him for his large size. He stood 6 feet 4 inches by the age of 15, and derided him as a real weirdo in a phone conversation to Kemper's father, unaware that her son had been eavesdropping. She also refused to show Kemper affection out of fear that she would turn him gay, and told the young Kemper that he reminded her of his father and that no woman would ever love him. Kemper later described her as a sick, angry woman, and it has been postulated that she had borderline personality disorder.
My mother was a sick, angry, hungry, and very sad woman. I hated her, but I wanted to love my mother. And I watched the alcohol increase. I watched her social life drop off. I watched her get bizarre. She had terrible pain from her life, earlier life, her upbringing, a failed marriage with my father. I'm a constant reminder of that failure.
Ed was incredibly tall for his age, so everyone assumed that he was older than he actually was. He started driving when he was only 10 years old. This was illegal, of course, but his mother must have allowed him to use the family car. One day, he drove himself to a carnival, and there was an attraction where people could slide their head into a real guillotine and pretend to have their heads cut off. Ed saw it as a strange contradiction that people were laughing and squealing in the face of death just for the thrill of it. Even though it was all just pretend, Ed Kemper got excited and found himself wishing that it was actually real. It was at this moment that his delusions began to get far worse, and he began having difficulty deciphering what was real and what was fantasy. This played a big part in his childhood. At the age of 14, he ran away from home to try and live with his father and his new stepmother in Van Nuys, California. But the reunion would only last a couple of months because he sent Ed to live with his parents on their 17-acre ranch in the foothills of Sierra Nevada. His grandparents lived in a remote location on the top of a mountain surrounded by their massive farmlands. He was completely isolated from the outside world here. His grandmother was just as domineering and abusive as his mother, and his grandfather had dementia. He described his grandfather as senile, and said his grandmother was constantly emasculating me and my grandfather. Since they lived on so much land, his grandparents would allow him to use a rifle to hunt rabbits, squirrels, and raccoons. The rifle had been given to him by his grandfather for hunting. His grandmother would carry the guns with her whenever she left the house. On August 27, 1964, at the age of 15, Kemper was sitting at the kitchen table with his grandmother Maud Matilda Kemper when they had an argument. Enraged, Kemper stormed off and retrieved a rifle that his grandfather had given him for hunting. He then re-entered the kitchen and fatally shot her in the head before firing twice more into her back. His grandmother's last words reportedly were, "Oh, you'd better not be shooting the birds again." He then dragged her corpse into her bedroom and hid it. His 72-year-old grandfather had gone out and was coming back. Edmund went to the window and decided the best course of action was to finish off his grandfather, as he did not want him to live through the pain of knowing that his wife was murdered. As he got out of the car, Kemper raised his rifle and shot him. He then hid the body in the garage. During a later interview, Ed Kemper said that it was a good thing that he was so isolated from society on the farm, because he was so angry at the world at that moment that he knows he would have become a mass murderer at age 15. The first thing he did was call his mother, as he did not know what else to do. He told her what had happened, and she told him to call the sheriff and turn himself in. So he did. When police showed up to arrest him, he was waiting for them on the porch. He went willingly. They placed him with the California Youth Authority. When he was asked for an explanation, he answered, "I wanted to see what it would be like to kill Grandma," and that he had killed his grandfather to spare him having found his wife dead. Since he was 15, when he killed his grandparents, Ed Kemper was still considered a minor, and therefore he was sent to Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security facility in San Luis Obispo County that houses mentally ill convicts. He was given multiple tests, and they discovered he had a genius-level IQ, and he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Ed Kemper became a model prisoner. He was even allowed access to some assessment devices and even administered them sometimes. He memorized 28 responses to 28 of the different assessment devices, thus providing himself with proper tools to convince those doctors that he was well. Being able to understand how these tests functioned allowed him to manipulate his psychiatrists. This meant he was able to remain calm and give the answers that the doctors wanted to hear when they interviewed him. At age 21 on his birthday on December 18, 1969, he was released. Now that he was a full-grown adult, he grew to be a 6'9" tall man. They had advised that he not be returned to live with his mother as it could trigger more violence. But he did move in with her. Clarnell then resided in Aptos, California, a short drive from where she worked as an administrative assistant at the University of California, Santa Cruz. They had frequent arguments and an unrelentingly toxic relationship. Having that shoved in his face regularly made Kemper project his hate towards his mother onto other women. His mother had raised him saying that all men were awful people. He had fantasies about being with women, but he didn't have fantasies about being in a relationship. While staying with his mother, Kemper attended community college following his parole requirements. Decided that he wanted to become a police officer because there was a lot of structure and order in that profession, and it would be a good and steady job. Oddly enough, it wasn't his juvenile record that stopped him from becoming an officer. His record had been expunged, so it was as if it had never happened at all. It was actually his height that stopped him, since there was a limit on how tall a police officer could be. He decided that if he couldn't get a job as an officer, he still wanted to be friends with cops, and he started hanging out with the police at a bar called the Jury Room, which was a popular hangout for police officers. They knew him as Big Ed and thought of him as a polite young man. He was intelligent and articulate. He worked menial jobs before gaining employment with the State of California Division of Highways, and for a short while he had his apartment, which he shared with a friend in Alameda, San Francisco, and had an independent life away from his mother. But when he fell into financial hardship, he was stuck living with her again. He bought a motorcycle with which he was involved in 2 separate accidents. He was paid $15,000 in settlement, with which he bought a 1969 Ford Galaxy and began to cruise the area. He noticed young girls had a habit of hitchhiking. He took up a habit of picking up hitchhikers and giving them rides. This was very common back in the 1960s and 70s, and college students. In his mind, he had this fantasy of killing a young woman that he would pick up. He thought about things he could do to them. He then prepared his car, placing plastic bags, knives, a blanket and handcuffs in his trunk, and awaited his victims. He would practice picking up both male and female hitchhikers and letting them go free. He did this over 150 times, just as practice runs, so that he could feel prepared for any scenario.
And I just started driving, and that was my main hobby, I'd say. And I saw a lot of people out hitchhiking, and I didn't select girls to pick up. I picked up anybody who wanted a ride. And over that whole 3-year period, it was the same way. If someone needed a ride, I picked them up. And less specifically, I was looking for someone to do in. All that driving around, it wasn't rehearsing. I made a game out of driving around, picking people up, and later on I discerned that some people wouldn't get in my car because of the situation. I'm a young man by myself. It's unsafe.
So I thought, well, gee, that kind of put me off. I'm not doing anything to anybody, so I want to see if I can change that situation where they'll want to get in and I can take them where they're going. Because I know I'm not going to do anything. And I got to where I could diffuse that situation. It's how you're looking. If you look, oh boy, all right, you start cranking the car over there. They're not going to get in your car because they can see you from half a block away drooling. But if you look at your watch and say, geez, I don't know if I have enough time, and you're kind of in the mirror and looking around, and you pull over, this guy's just a businessman going somewhere, and get in his car, we'll go where we're going. And it's little games I played so they get in the car. And then we chatted, and I talked about things, and I found out where their orientations were, and their little, what they used to judge, and who could get in, and who they could get in with, and who they couldn't, right? In that sense, it's been interpreted as what do you call it, rehearsing. It's not true. It's like playing chess.
At the bar, he was listening very closely to what police officers were saying about their new cases, and they mentioned the fact that teenage girls ran away all the time only to show up sometime later. In his mind, he was living out a fantasy where he would pick up a girl so that he could rape and murder her. Through all of these practice conversations, he figured out what to do in order to make people feel more at ease. He also concocted a plan to drop a chapstick into the passenger door so that if his victims tried to escape, they could no longer open the door from the inside. His fantasy was finally realized on May 7, 1972, when he picked up two 18-year-old girls named Mary Ann Pess and Anita Lucchesa in Berkeley, California. They asked for a ride to Stanford University. He drove off the highway to a secluded area in the woods with which he was familiar from his work at the highway department, without alerting his passengers that he had changed directions from where they wanted to go. He then told them that he intended to have non-consensual sex with them and that he was going to take them to his apartment. He handcuffed Ann Pess to the backseat and locked Anita in the trunk. He stabbed and strangled Mary Ann, who put up a fight and slit her throat before opening the trunk and killing Anita in the same way. After they were dead, he raped them and stuffed their bodies into the trunk of his Ford Galaxy. On the drive home to Alameda, where he stayed with a roommate, a police officer pulled him over due to a broken tail light. He was able to remain calm as if nothing had happened. The officer told him that his tail light was out and he went on his way. Kemper later says he was excited. If the police officer had tried to do a routine check, then Kemper would have killed him. At his house, he brought the bodies inside and took them to his room, where he dismembered them and took photos. He said that he also engaged in sexual acts with the bodies. He then put them into bags and dumped these bags miles apart in Loma Prieta Mountain in order to throw the police off. When the girls failed to arrive at their destination, their parents contacted the police. But runaways were all too frequent in those days and there were no clues to where they had gone. The police therefore did not do a follow-up. On August 15, the remains of a head were recovered and identified as that of Pess. No other remains were found and it was assumed that both girls were murdered. Universities in the local area began to tell their students not to accept rides from strangers. They also told everyone that if they had no choice but to accept a ride, to only get into cars with a Kemper sticker on them. Ironically, Ed Kemper did have one of these stickers since his mother worked for the college. On the evening of September 14, 1972, he picked up a 15-year-old girl named Aiko Ku who needed a ride to a ballet class. She had missed her bus. He again drove to a remote area, where he pulled a gun on Ku before accidentally locking himself out of his car. However, Ku let him back inside, although the gun was still in the car.
Let me back in the car. I locked myself out. She opened the door for me. My gun was under the seat. What in the hell am I doing telling you that? Am I a masochist? Am I looking to be tormented further? I'm trying to show you just how awful this got, how commanding these rages got.
He tried suffocating her, but she wouldn't die, so he strangled her and sexually assaulted her. He placed her in the trunk of his car and drove off to a bar to drink. He then went back to his house and dismembered her body. On January 7, 1973, Cindy Shaw disappeared. Someone saw her get a ride and then she was gone. He shot her with a .22 caliber pistol and killed her. He then took her body into the house while his mother was inside and hid her body in his closet overnight. When his mother left for work the next morning, he had sexual intercourse with and removed the bullet from Shaw's corpse, then dismembered and decapitated her in his mother's bathtub. Less than 2 days after Cindy went missing, dismembered arms and legs were found on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, and an upper torso washed ashore which was identified via X-rays. The lower torso also came in, and a surfer found her left hand which offered fingerprints. But her head and right hand remained missing. Ed Kemper had killed Cindy. Instead of disposing of Cindy's remains as he had done with the others, he buried her head in the yard facing towards his mother's bedroom window. He did that because, according to him, his mother always wanted people to look up to her. Cindy's head was sitting in the trunk of his car when he went to his state-mandated therapy session. His psychiatrist was convinced that he was better, and they released him from the court order to continue therapy. Even though he killed months apart, Ed Kemper continued to give rides to young women on a regular basis just so that he could get information about what the public was saying about him. These women were so unaware that Ed Kemper was a murderer that they would even have a conversation with him about this coed killer, speculating about his motivations. He would hang out at the jury room bar to learn new information about the case. He was analyzing what he was doing and learning how to perfect his technique. He discovered their strategies and was able to allude to them and do not come across as a killer. He learned how to make people feel safe around him. This is how he convinced women to get into his car. He also watched a lot of crime shows on TV in order to understand every possible way that they might catch up to him. For example, he had the urge to go to the funerals of his victims and pay his respects, but when he saw the detectives always show up to the funeral of a homicide victim, he knew not to give in to these natural impulses. He knew how to evade police officers. On February 5, 1973, he got into a very intense argument with his mother, and he went out and killed 2 more girls. With heightened suspicion of a serial killer preying on hitchhikers in the Santa Cruz area, students had been advised to accept rides only from cars with university stickers on them. Kemper was able to obtain a sticker, as his mother worked at University of California, Santa Cruz. He separately encountered 23-year-old Rosalind Heather Thorpe and 20-year-old Alice Helen Allison Liu on the UCSC campus. According to Kemper, he first encountered Thorpe as she exited a building, having attended a lecture. Thorpe entered the front passenger seat and, believing Kemper to be a fellow student, began chatting amiably as he drove. Shortly thereafter, he observed Liu trying to catch a ride. Kemper stopped his vehicle, and Liu entered the back seat of his car. Shortly thereafter, Kemper slowed his vehicle, and then shot Thorpe in the head with a .22 pistol. He then turned toward Liu as she cowered and squirmed in the back seat of his car. His first 2 shots missed the terrified girl, although his third bullet hit her in the temple. Their bodies were then wrapped in blankets. Kemper again brought his victims' bodies back to his mother's house. This time he beheaded them in his car and carried the headless corpses into his mother's house to have sexual intercourse with them. He then dismembered the bodies, removed the bullets to prevent identification, and discarded their remains the next morning. There were no leads whatsoever in their disappearances. On March 4, a couple of hikers found a skull and a jawbone while hiking not far from Highway 1 in San Mateo County. They were not from the same person. The police searched the entire area and found another skull which was later identified as Rosalind's and Allison's. Allison had been shot twice in the head and Rosalind once. He finally made the connection that the anger he felt towards his mother was the trigger that set him off on this killing spree. He knew that if he wanted the killings to stop, he would need to kill his mother.
It was springtime. It was April. And for 2 months I hadn't killed. And I said, it's not going to happen to any more girls. It's got to stay between me and my mother, and I can't get away from her. We're still fighting. She's still belittling me. I'm like a puppet on a string, and I entertain her. She knows all my buttons, and I dance like a puppet with that pain. And it had even gotten physical, to where I had physically grabbed her and thrown her onto her bed, trying to emphasize a point that I was threatening to kill her.
But this plan would be put on hold when the police showed up at the Kemper residence. A few days earlier, the police received a tip that Ed Kemper had purchased a gun. The shop owner could see that his personal record had been expunged and that he had committed a murder when he was under 18. The shop owner reported it to the police and gave them Ed Kemper's name and address. When the police showed up, they recognized Ed Kemper from the bar, so they assured him that it was just formality. Ed led them to his closet where he kept several guns. Sitting next to those weapons was a woman's purse and a box filled with mementos from his victims. Before the police officers took notice, he quickly distracted them and led them out to his car where he had more hidden weapons. They did not suspect him of being the murderer, but he was very paranoid and he was convinced that they were on to him. For an entire week, he planned his mother's murder. On the 20th of April 1973, Ed Kemper's mother came home from a party. It was late at night and Ed Kemper woke up to hear her stumble through the front door at 4 o'clock in the morning. She went into her room and he followed her. While sitting in her bed reading a book, she noticed Kemper enter her room and said to him, "I suppose you're going to want to sit up all night and talk now." Kemper replied, "No, good night," and waited for her to go to bed. He crept into her bedroom and smashed her head in with a claw hammer. He then decapitated her, sexually violated her face and ripped out her vocal cords, shoving them in the garbage disposal. Then he placed her head on the mantelpiece, said to it what he wanted to say for over an hour and started throwing darts at it. Kemper hid his mother's corpse in a closet and went to drink at a nearby bar. When he came back home, he called up his mother's best friend, Sally Hallett, and said that he had made a dinner for them both. When she arrived, he strangled her and removed her head. He then stuffed their bodies into a closet and left a note for the police. It read, "APPX. 5:15 a.m. Saturday. No need for her to suffer any more at the hands of this horrible, murderous butcher. It was quick, asleep, the way I wanted it. Not sloppy and incomplete, gents. Just a lack of time. I got things to do." He packed his bags and drove 1,000 miles for a few days. He drove non-stop to Pueblo, Colorado, taking caffeine pills to stay awake for the over 1,000-mile journey. He believed he was the target of an active manhunt. After not hearing any news on the radio about the murders of his mother and Hallett when he arrived in Pueblo, he found a phone booth and called the police. But he realized he couldn't live with the guilt any longer, and he actually wanted to stop hiding and pay for his crimes. On April 23, 1973, in Pueblo, Colorado, Edmund Kemper found the nearest payphone to call and confess that he was the coed killer. He was scared as he had 200 rounds of ammunition and 3 guns in the car. The officer that picked up the call thought it was a prank and suggested that Ed call him later. Kemper did so but had a difficult time convincing them that it was true. He continued to call and convince them to go check out his mother's house. He said that a police officer had been at his house not long ago to confiscate a gun that he had purchased. He waited patiently there for them to arrive. On the ride back, he gave the police officers every little detail of his crimes, and the police officers felt sick from listening to him. The police officer did go to check his mother's house. As he entered, he was hit with the smell of death, a putrid odor of decomposition. As he checked the house, he saw blood and hair in the closet. He then secured the crime scene and called in the coroner and the detectives. They found the 2 bodies decapitated and his mother had been used for dart practice. Her tongue and throat were cut off. When he was in custody, Ed Kemper openly admitted that he could not control these delusions that had taken over his mind. He was willing to talk and waived his right to an attorney twice. He confessed to everything he had done for hours. He then took detectives to where he had committed the murders and tossed parts of his victims that had not been found. He described having sex with the heads of his victims and loved the feeling of totally possessing them. He begged for a lobotomy so that he never had the urge to kill anyone ever again. But that never happened. He was indicted on 8 counts of first-degree murder on May 7, 1973. While awaiting trial, he tried killing himself twice by slashing his wrists. He failed both times. The trial began on October 23, 1973. 3 prosecution psychiatrists found him to be sane. Due to Kemper's explicit and detailed confession, his counsel's only option was to plead not guilty by reason of insanity to the charges. On November 1, Kemper took the stand. He testified that he killed the victims because he wanted them, for myself, like possessions, and attempted to convince the jury that he was insane based on the reasoning that his actions could have been committed only by someone with an aberrant mind. He stated that 2 beings inhabited his body and that when the killer personality took over, it was kind of like blacking out. On November 8, 1973, the 6-man, 6-woman jury deliberated for 5 hours before declaring Kemper sane and guilty on all counts. He asked for the death penalty, requesting death by torture. However, with a moratorium placed on capital punishment by the Supreme Court of California, he instead received 7 years to life for each count, with these terms to be served concurrently, and was sentenced to the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. He is still alive today, and he's currently spending his life in prison. In his time behind bars, he became a model inmate and he has shown a sense of remorse for his crimes, and he gladly assisted in the research on the psychology of serial killers by agreeing to video and audio interviews. He also began to teach classes in computer literacy to fellow inmates, and he has since spoken very eloquently. He has even started reading audiobooks for the blind. He has spent over 5,000 hours narrating books with several hundred completed recordings in his name. In 2015, he experienced a stroke and was declared medically disabled, therefore he stopped all the work he was doing. He has participated in a number of interviews by psychiatrists and has been forthcoming in the nature of his crimes. Some psychiatrists have said that he was a sociopath and that no amount of rehabilitation would have made him not kill. Others believe he was a victim of circumstances and abuse and that if he had had a better childhood he would have not been killed. What do you think? Thank you for your constant support of my channel. Please subscribe for more content like this. Comment and share for more. Thank you.